listening.
So now flick to the second part of this first session in the morning, the emerging scientists part. The emerging scientists is always a key part of the symposium for those of you that have attended. And we've taken a different shape, but this year, given the current scenario. I want to thank Local Land Services Hunter for sponsoring not only this session on the symposium, but particularly the emerging scientists competition. So we have 7 emerging scientists that will be sharing their research. The scientists had to submit abstracts to be eligible to apply for this program, and we selected the best abstract. Then the ones that got selected had to submit a video that you might have seen on our social media on the Dairy Research Foundation Facebook page. And we've also judged those videos to select a winner. And the last part of this competition is the presentation, in which each emerging scientist gets to have 5 minutes of the stage to present their research. There is some people infiltrated among the audience that will be judging the emerging scientists. So I will first like to invite to the stage Patricia Colusso from the University of Sydney, that she'll be talking about grazing dairy cows with a virtual fence.
And start video. Hi everyone. Oh my goodness. Hi, so thank you for coming on today. I'm here to talk to you guys about an experiment I conducted that looked at using virtual fencing for dairy cows. So a bit about the technology. I used these pre-commercial prototype neckbands that sat on top of the cow's head, and it uses the GPS positioning to determine your virtual fence boundary. When an animal approaches that boundary, that's when it will receive the warning audio tone, and then if the animal continues forward, that's when it's paired with that electric pulse. So over time, the dairy cows can associate that audio with the electric pulse and remain within your boundary. So for the experiment, the aim was to look at if we could use a virtual fence to graze your dairy cows and contain them from a fresh allocation of pasture. So in particular, assessing the worst case scenario of having reduced feed or hungry cows, and testing if we could just offer them the post-graze residual. Can you keep them contained? So for the experiment itself, I had 10 dairy cows that were pre-trained to the virtual fence stimuli, and I had placed them out on a 1 hectare paddock for 10 days in 8 pasture strips. So every day except for day 5 and 10, they were given the fresh strip in front of them. However, on day 5 and 10, I actually withheld them, so they were just kept on the previous day's allocation and only allowed to graze that residual. So what that meant for pasture was days. It averaged out to be offering them around 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and they grazed that down to about 1,600 kilograms, making it out to be about 6.75 kilos of food consumed by the dairy cows. And in comparison, on the hold-off days, they were given around 1,700 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and they only consumed about 1.65 kilos per cow. So as we all know, dairy cows will eat as much as you offer them, and that's where we see an increase on the grazing days, not so much on the holding off days, and we can assume that they were hungry on our holding off days. So for the virtual fence stimuli, we did find that on the first hold-off day, there was an increase in the number of audio and pulse delivered, and that was attributed to that increased hunger, but also a change in the routine. So previous to that, every day in the morning, they were given the fresh strip in front of them. However, on day 5, they were not. And so that mix of hunger and change in routine influenced them to interact with and sort of test that fence throughout the day in hopes that it had moved. Also important to note that However, we did see an increase in the audio and pulse counts, that the overall number of paired stimuli, so an audio with that followed by a pulse, remained the same, so that they did retain that learning, and they were responding majority to that audio tone. So even with increased hunger, they were responding to that virtual fence. We also did note strong individual variation. So in particular, I had my cow 1, who was very active and would like to graze alongside the virtual fence, and my cow 11, who was the least active. And as you can see, the average in stimuli delivered over the 10 days vary. So this is sort of a plot I made of how they utilised the space on day 4 and 5. So this is the same strip of pasture. As you can see on day 4, they're just given fresh access to that. So they're all quite tightly knit and grazing intensively. As compared to day 5, they're quite spread out, as they are having to seek out the feed based on just grazing that residual. So I also just plotted the locations in which the audio and pulse were delivered. And so as you can see, my red line is sort of the baseline of the virtual fence. However, you can see most of those points are within around 10 meters from that. And so it's also important to note that every cow has a slightly different virtual fence based on their GPS technology. And we did determine that variation was about 4 to 8 meters between our cows. So really that 10 meters is not including that variation. So we can say that we did effectively contain our dairy cows in our allocated area. So the findings and implications for our experiment was that we did note variations in dairy cows' virtual fences, how they spread out on that pasture. So again, our cow 1, who was constantly grazing alongside my virtual fence, really getting that pasture front, and my cow 11, who was a bit far back, as you can see in the picture, she is watching the other cows. And we also saw a variation in number of stimuli. So the first day we held them off from fresh pasture was a day we saw an increase in both the audio and pulse, but not the paired stimuli. So again, they were still retaining that learning and responding to the audio tone alone with their increased hunger. But by the second hold-off period, we did not see this. So again, they established that routine of being held off, as the next day they were going to get fresh feed anyway. So that identifies this potential that we could be training our dairy cows to be strip grazed with holding off periods and reduced feed. So overall, we were able to strip graze our dairy cows with holding off periods. And before I go, I'd just like to acknowledge the funding of this project was by the Australian Commonwealth Government as part of their Rural R&D for Profit program. I'd like to thank you for your time and welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Pat, for that presentation. Really interesting. There was one question that came through. What do you think would have happened if you would have stretched the restriction to another day?
I think potentially we would see the same sort of increase in the audio and pulse. I'm not too sure because there was quite a lot of feed left over, the residual. Potentially still just majority of it an increase in the number of audio and pulses delivered to the cows. It definitely was something that we could look at as, again, reducing the hunger again. But they were pre-trained, so hopefully they would still respect that boundary. Again, yeah, that answers the question. That would be something very interesting to look at. Yep.
Excellent, Pat. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll wait for the results.
Yes, thank you.
No worries. So I'd now like to invite to the stage Meghan Connelly. Meghan is a student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the US. And she's studying the influence of prepartum dietary cation and ion difference and the decline of calcium at the onset of lactation. Thank you very much, Meghan.
Hi, so like they said, my name is Meghan Connelly. I'm actually a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison over here in the US, and we are really interested in calcium metabolism. So as you can see, I have a couple Australian collaborators. So I've actually was in Australia earlier this year, but I'll dive right into our project. So we're really interested in hypocalcemia, but specifically the hypocalcemia that's found in the transition cow, because large amounts of calcium are excreted into milk during lactation. And there's this really dramatic change from late gestation into lactation as the mammary gland starts to have this demand for calcium as it synthesizes milk. So there's a lot of different management strategies that we use in order to help the cow, because a lot of times dysregulation occurs during this time frame. And one such tool is a negative DCAD diet that we feed prepartum. Negative DCAD diets instigate a mild metabolic acidosis that allows a cow to have an improved transition into lactation. So the aim of our study was to determine how the magnitude of calcium decline at the onset of lactation alters calcium metabolism postpartum. So what we did in order to answer this question was we took 32 multiparous Holstein cows and randomly assigned them to be fed either a negative or positive DCAD diet 27 days prior to patrition. Then, immediately after patrition for 24 hours, we then did a continuous infusion of either calcium gluconate in order to maintain normal calcemia, or a 10% dextrose infusion, which was the metabolizable equivalency of the gluconic acid, which was found in the calcium gluconate. This resulted in 4 treatments with an N equals 8 per treatment. So we really like timelines because I think it kind of helps us to visualize it a bit better. But 27 days prior to patrition, our cows were fed either a negative or positive DCAD diet, which was formulated for either plus or minus 120 milliequivalents per kilo. And then what we really were interested in is this time right around patrition. So from -4 days through +4 days, we hung out with our cows quite a lot, and we took blood and urine samples every 6 hours. And so, as I mentioned, for those 24 hours immediately after the cow calved, so post-patrition, we did a continuous infusion. This continuous infusion was either of calcium gluconate or 10% dextrose. And during that time frame, we sampled blood every 30 minutes in order to modulate our infusion rate. We also followed out later, but my focus for this presentation will really be on this every 6-hour time frame for -4 through +4 days. So I'm going to get into our calcium results because I think that's really kind of the interesting part of this study. So we measured ionized calcium, which is the free metabolizable calcium, so really what's available for the cow to use. So on our x-axis, we have our hours relative to calving, with -102 hours being -4 days prepartum, and then the 0 hour denoting the sample that was taken immediately after patrition. So all of our cows were sampled and then hooked up to infusion within 15 minutes of the calf being out. So as you can see, at -4 days prior to patrition, there was no difference in ionized calcium concentrations based on prepartum diet. But as cows started to approach patrition, we started to see a clear separation between dietary DCAD treatments. With about 60 to 54 hours prior to patrition, negative DCAD cows had a higher ionized calcium concentration relative to their positive DCAD counterparts. And then immediately after patrition, denoted by that 0 hour, you can see that cows fed a negative DCAD diet prepartum had higher blood ionized calcium concentrations. But regardless of prepartum dietary DCAD diet fed, all cows did see a decline in calcium as they approached patrition. So next up, this is our postpartum, as that was our prepartum ionized calcium results. So our x-axis is still our hours relative to calving, with 0 being that sample taken immediately after, and 96 hours being +4 days. So as you can see, our calcium gluconate infusion did successfully increase circulating ionized calcium concentrations, denoted by the red and blue lines. And as you can see, after we terminated our infusions at 24 hours postpartum, our cows crashed and burned ionized calcium-wise. You can see that this caused a really severe alteration in their calcium metabolism, and they kept declining at 6, 12, and 18 hours after termination of infusion, but started to recover ionized calcium at 24 hours after termination of calcium gluconate infusion. When we look at our dextrose infused cows, you can see that cows fed a negative DCAD diet had higher ionized calcium concentrations relative to cows fed a positive DCAD diet. And interestingly, you'll see that that 24-hour time period is really how long it took the dextrose cows also to start to see an increase in ionized calcium, really suggesting that feedback, especially in this really kind of challenging calcium time for dairy cows, does take about 24 hours to occur. But by 4 days postpartum, or 72 hours after termination of infusion, there was no difference between any treatment groups, and all cows were normal calcemic. So when you put this all together, you can see that cows experienced a decline in calcium as they approached partition, and negative DCAD cows had improved calcium metabolism as they went through the postpartum period. So in conclusions, and to summarize this is my cow conclusion because I'm from a dairy farm here in the US. Treatment with calcium gluconate during the 24 hours after partition negatively impacted the immediate postpartum calcium homeostasis, regardless of prepartum DCAD diet treatment. And that negative DCAD diets better equipped cows to respond to calcium requirements in the transition period. And so with that, I'm pretty sure I'm over on time. I'd like to acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Laura Hernandez, and my funding sources, and Dr. Elliot Block, Ian Lean, and Rachel Rodney Harris, and then everyone else that was a really key feature in order to allow this study to go forward, because we spent a lot of time in the barn, to be honest with you. And with that, I can take any questions pending how long we have.
Excellent, Megan. Thank you very much for that presentation. There's a question that came through and says, great work. What were the negative and positive DCAD levels fed?
Minus 100 and plus 120 milliequivalents per kilo.
Excellent. And then there's another one. What is the reason for having milk fever in cows in their 8th calving and showing milk fever 2 months after calving? I don't know if this is necessarily something that you mentioned.
Yeah, so as cows age, they're at an increased risk for milk fever. Older cows, so one of the photos at the beginning on my introduction slides, cows really rely on their skeletal reserve actually in order to use that calcium to maintain it for the mammary gland, to meet that need for milk synthesis. And so as cows get older, it takes a little bit longer for them to mobilize their bone. And those 2 months, the question for the hypocalcemia for 2 months in, I think we get asked that question a lot, and I think it's something that's really dependent on kind of what's going on your farm. So you can see, we always get asked that question, and I think there's a lot of different things that require calcium, and calcium is so pertinent. So if you have a cow that's maybe been challenged with an immune function, or she had a heat and went off feed, because there's so much calcium requirement, that any type of manipulation where it's having an increased demand from another tissue, or you're just not ingesting as much, it can all result in hypocalcemia.
Excellent. Megan, thank you very much for your time and your presentation, and we'll talk to you later. So I would now like to invite Juan Ignacio Gargiulo from the University of Sydney to the stage, and he'll be talking about ways to increase profitability in robotic milking.
Thanks, Nico. So the interest in robotic milking technology is growing, and in Australia we found that this technology is achieving similar results to conventional farms. However, we identified also in a recent study that robotic milking systems are achieving a large variability, or there is a large variability in profitability between farms across Australia. Therefore, the aim of our study were to identify the key drivers of profitability and productivity to see what were the best farmers achieving or doing, and also try to simulate changes in those drivers, for example, to test base case scenarios. For this purpose, we use a really extensive database that had more than 100 indicators, and that was collected over a 3-year period. And actually, we are collecting a 4th year. Included data from 28 farms from Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, and Chile, more robot and system data, and also economic data from farms in Australia. So what we did was we put all these indicators together and we built a model that trying to identify the main factors driving profitability. And we end up finding that there were two main indicators that explain profitability. One was the milk harvested per robot, or the kilos of milk per robot, and the other one was the total labor on the farm. Of course, milk harvested was positively correlated and total labor negatively correlated. These two indicators, or this model, explains 70% of the variability in profitability in robotic farms. As milk harvested was the main indicator or the main driver of profit, we also put all the information or all the indicators together to try to identify the factors driving milk harvested. And we found that there were 5 main factors that drive milk harvested, were the number of cows per robot, the milking frequency, the milk flow, the timing robot, and the days in milk. This model explained 90% of the variance in milk harvested. So then we conducted a simulation, a Monte Carlo simulation, and we tried to answer a common question done by the farmers, that is, should I increase the milking frequency or should I milk more cows? So we put these two models in this simulation, and we found that the average farm is achieving a profitability or our operating profit margin of 11%, with a milk harvested of 1,200 kilos of milk with 55 cows per robot, and with a milking frequency of 2.2. So when we simulated what happened if we increase the milking frequency to the top 25%, we found that actually it is likely that these farms will be able to milk less cows per robot and achieve a similar milk harvested and profitability than the base case of the average farm. However, when we increase the number of cows to 70, or the top 25% average, we found that it is likely that these farms will actually reduce slightly the milking frequency, but overall they will achieve higher milk harvested and higher profitability. So the main messages of our research was that milk harvested and total labor are the two main drivers of profitability in robotic farms. We found that every 100 kilos of increase in milk harvested, profitability increases around 3.3%. And we found also that there is a big opportunity to increase cows per robot, and of course, increase productivity and profitability with this, but every farm should identify their own areas of improvement. So I would like to acknowledge the Dairy Research Foundation and the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry for supporting this research. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Juan, for that presentation. Really insightful. There's a question around what are the main drivers for farmers to adopt robotic milking? You say that labor is a key driver of the profit. Are farmers looking at reducing labor as one of the drivers?
In this project, we asked farmers about actually that question, and reducing the total labor was not the main driver. It was around labor and labor availability, and around lifestyle and flexibility in the times, and not that in reducing the total amount of labor. So they are shifting, or they are doing less heavy labor or less routinary labor, and shifting to more friendly kind of labor. So.
Excellent. And then what would you think would happen if farmers increase cow number, but also increase milking frequency of those cows?
Well, here we simulated just increasing one factor at a time. But of course, in many cases, there will be an increase or decrease in 2 or 3 factors at a time. So of course, it is possible, but as we found in this research, it is likely that if you try to push more cows, it is likely that you will have less time available in the robot, therefore you will be able to milk less cows. But of course, there are some exceptional farms that are achieving more milking frequency and milking more cows. Of course, that will drive even more milk harvested and of course more profitability at the end.
Excellent. Thank you, Juan, very much for your presentation.
Thanks, Nico.
I would now like to welcome to the stage Alexandra Green from the University of Sydney. Ali is going to be talking about vocal characteristics of peripartum dairy cows.
Thank you, Nico. One moment. Okay. So thank you for having me here today. This research was brought to you by the University of Sydney in conjunction with the University of Jean Monnet in France, and it involves looking at the vocalizations of dairy cattle over the postpartum period. So a little bit of background into the research of vocal behaviour. Vocalizations can provide a non-invasive way of assessing the welfare state of animals and observing them with relatively little disturbance to their behaviours of interest. In cattle, traditional measures of vocalizations involve whether an animal is vocal as well as their calling rate and the different types of calls they produce. However, these are quite conspicuous measures, and their other more detailed measures are yet to be studied. So the emotional content of vocalizations has recently been studied in a range of livestock species, but cattle are relatively understudied. And the reason we can look at the emotional content of calls is because when an animal is exposed to a stressor, this activates their sympathetic nervous system, which leads to physiological changes to respiration, salivation, and muscle tension in their vocal folds. And this in turn leads to very noticeable changes to their vocal features. So with this in mind, the research I conducted looked at the differences in vocalizations and vocal gestures of peripartum dairy cows and heifers during calving and calf separation. So the methods involved, I conducted the study on a commercial barn with 19 Holstein Friesian heifers and cows. I recorded them for 60 minutes with both audio and video, and I subjected them to, well, I recorded them when they were calving. They were all assisted with their calving, so either restrained in a head bale with a calving jack or lying down with ropes. And then they were separated from their calf with a fence line, and I recorded them here as well. So I then did my acoustic analyses with 393 vocalizations. I looked at 12 different vocal parameters relating to the pitch of their vocalization, which is indicated by this blue line here, things relating to their call duration, and then non-linearities of their voice, so any irregularities, so how rough their voice sounded. I then also looked at their phonatory gestures at the time of vocal production, so their mouth position as well as their tongue position at the time of vocalizing, and then I conducted my statistics with RStudio. And for the mouth and tongue position, firstly, what I found was that with the calving cows, they produce more of these open mouth calls, and this was particularly pronounced in the primiparis cows. And they also exhibited this tongue curling behavior, which was only seen at the time of vocal production and purely during the context of calving, and this was also mainly exhibited by the primiparis heifers. By contrast, the separated cows produced more mixed calls, so these are calls with a mouth configuration containing both open and closed mouth components. As for the vocalizations, the calving cows, once again, there was a parity effect. So their vocalizations in this context were longer and lower in mean pitch, and this was especially the case for the primiparis cows once again. And they had more non-linearities in their voice, so overall their voice sounded a lot rougher and harsher, and you can hear it right now. In comparison, the separated cows, again, there was no context effect. There was a context effect, but there was no parity effect. Their voice was more variable in pitch across the call duration, and they also had a higher maximum pitch in their call, and it sounded something like this. So discussion time. So basically what we've shown that there are different contextual cues in their voice, and this probably relates to the different communicative roles of their vocalizations. So for the calving cows, it's likely due to this, the parity effect is likely due to the difficulty the heifers had with calving, and represents the effort and exertion that they are putting into the calving process. So this leads to intense muscular and energy expenditure, which in turn leads to airflow changes and then leads to these unique vocal characteristics. And this has similarly been demonstrated in humans upon effort and exertion upon giving birth. And now the combination of the low frequency of the call with the longer call duration, the open mouth configuration, the tongue curling, and the overall louder sound may assist with broadcasting the vocalization over longer distances, and may have the communicative role of seeking help from the farmer or their herd mates. In comparison to the separated cows, there was no parity effect, which suggests that both parities were equally as distressed by the separation process, and this was what was also demonstrated in previous behavioural studies. And the calls were likely for shorter distance contact, reflected by their higher pitch, and they may be for regaining social contact with their calf. So the implications of this research, so it contributes to our understanding of cattle vocal communication, and suggests that we can visually and orally assess cow welfare over the peripartum period. And it also, with the potential emotional encoding of their voice, so the stress in their voice, it may encourage farmers or farming practices to be adopted and shaped according to the vocal feedback of different livestock. So thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Ali, for that presentation. There's a question that came through. What was the reason for assisting the calvings?
I went to a commercial farm, and just to control for the differences in the vocal features, I just decided to select the cows that were all assisted. I did record some cows that were not assisted, however, they didn't really vocalize as much. So that was the reason.
Excellent. And I have another question. Do you think the vocalization or the behaviors would have changed if the calf was out of sight? So you would have kind of completely separated the calf and the cow?
Yes, I think so. So I think there's been some research done comparing separation treatments with a fence line where you've got the visual and some physical contact, and without the fence line where you just take them fully separated. And I think that with the visual and physical stimuli, they are a little bit more aroused because they do want to try and make contact, and they do vocalize more because they have the calf there to vocalize too.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ali, for your presentation. I would now like to invite to the stage Sarah Mack, also from the University of Sydney. And Sarah will be talking about pasture-based dairy cow-calf rearing system study.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry. I'm excited to be able to present our pasture-based cow-calf system with you this morning. Oops, there we go. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. There we go. Yesterday, you heard from Dan Weary from UBC, where he presented this, the consumer's ideal dairy system. With Australia being pasture-based, we thought, why not, let's just have a go at this and see what we get. So we wanted to kind of answer some basic questions such as how feasible is this? What are some of the effects on the calf, and how will full separation affect, how will cows react to that? So what we did was we took 6 cow-calf pairs and put them into a paddock together, all of which having bull calves. Because there were 6, we did strip grazing, and to emulate rotational grazing, we took the electrical fence and gave them a new strip of fresh pasture each day, and increasing the backing fence to allow regrowth in the grazed areas. The electrical tape was high enough for our calves to get underneath, so they had access to the entire paddock. They had access to the top pick of the fresh pasture, and we were able to kind of create a calf creep where the cows were not able to access the calf pellets. So twice a day, I myself would take separate the cows from the calves, take them up to the dairy, have them be milked, and then bring them back. To ensure that the calves stayed in the paddock, we had a yard system set up with 2 gates so that the calves were not able to leave the paddock. We kept them together for about 100 days. Our average birth weight was 42 kilos, and around weaning, our calves were weighed 206 kilos. That gives us an average daily gain of 1.4 kilos per day, which is actually double the industry standard. After weaning, we put the calves on a truck and Cameron drove them to a local abattoir where we were able to get meat quality and rumen development, which gave us an average carcass weight of 122 kilos, which is a dressing percentage of 59%. This is just some more pictures of our calf veal meat. As you can see, it is red in color and it has white fat color, which are both favorable characteristics in the meat industry. So looking back on our study, we were able to see that this system is feasible. However, adapting to this type of system takes time. This was monitored in cow turnarounds or their motivation to reunite with their calf, as well as vocalizations as we were separating them to push them up to the parlor. Both of these behaviors decreased over time and were at very low percentages by midway through the study. Our calves had intense growth rates resulting in quality meat. However, this does come with the cost of milk consumption, and we calculated that our calves around weaning were drinking about 20 liters. That being said, there's no rearing facility, and labor for rearing calves in this system looks quite different. There is the downside, though, that monitoring individual calf health as well as consumption is limited. However, with growing technologies being accessible to calves, that might be something to be implemented into this type of system. We also use 6 cow-calf pairs, so we don't know what this would look like scaled up to a commercial farm of a couple hundred cows. This does give a positive consumer perception of the dairy industry. And when we looked at our weaning process, we only looked at the cow's response to full separation. And we compared the behavior of our cows to cows that were separated within 24 hours from their calf and saw that they were not more stressed, but they were not less stressed than the industry standard. We didn't look at the calves' response to weaning, which will be very important for your replacement heifers. So there is more research to be done. With that in mind, this is just a stepping stone study. We wanted to get the foundation to go forward from that. But this idea of this type of dairy system, especially in Australia, may not be as far as what we think it is. Thank you. And I will take any questions at this time.
Thank you, Sarah, for that presentation. There's a question is, did you do an economic analysis of a scaled up system?
We did not. That was out of the scope of this study. However, now that we see that it is tangible, we are looking forward to doing more studies, growing the number of cows that we use in this type of system.
Excellent. Then there's another question around at what age did you wean the calves, and is that aligned with the industry?
Yes, so our calves were weaned at 4 months of age. So the average time that they were average about 106 days. However, that being said, we did have a couple that were about 122 days, but average about 3-4 months of age, yes.
Excellent. Sarah, thank you very much. There's a couple of other questions that I will direct you to answer through the Q&A tab if you have a minute.
Great.
And we'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Sineka Munidasa from the University of Melbourne. Sineka will be talking about the impact of feeding management on enteric methane emission of dairy cows. Sineka, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It is really nice to talk to you all through DRF Emerging Scientist program this year. I'm Sineka Munidasa, master's student from University of Melbourne. Today, I'm going to talk about impact of feeding management on enteric methane emission using my research findings. So feeding management and enteric methane emission both are important and interconnected areas in terms of economic and environmental perspectives. In dairy cows, 2 to 12% of energy intake lost through enteric methane emission, which reduce the production efficiency. Also, in terms of environment, enteric methane contributed over 70% of total agriculture greenhouse gas emissions in Australia, which ultimately cause for climate change. So it is important to look into this topic. Therefore, in this research, I have looked into enteric methane emission and enteric methane emission intensity in terms of concentrate supplementation and post-grazing residual height. I have calculated enteric methane emission intensity as enteric methane per unit of fat and protein corrected milk, because dairy farmers will not be willing to implement methane mitigation strategies if they decrease milk production. And also it is important to focus into mitigation strategies with higher production efficiencies for feeding growing population. So this is the methodology that I have adapted in my study. Data from 32 mid-lactation Friesian Jersey crossbred cows were used in this study, and impact from concentrate feeding on concentrate supplementation under grazing conditions were studied using cows fed with 3.6 kilogram of concentrate per day and compared them with pure pasture feeding. Then impact from post-grazing residual height was studied using two post-grazing residual heights such as 3.7 centimeters and 4.6 centimeters. This is the equation that I have used to estimate the enteric methane emission, as it captures 3 factors influence on enteric methane emissions, such as dry matter intake, fatty acid, and NDF. This is the result of concentrate supplementation. Here we can see enteric methane emission is higher in pasture plus concentrate group compared to pasture only group. However, emission intensity or average milk production is not significant in this study. Let's look at the impact of post-grazing residual height. Here you can see nutrient composition and quality of the pasture. We can see there's no significant difference between high post-grazing residual height and low post-grazing residual height groups, and also dry matter intake, the major factor influence on enteric methane emission, is not significant in this research. Therefore, enteric methane emission intensity and average milk production is not significantly different between high post-grazing residual height and low post-grazing residual height groups. Especially this study conducted over single grazing rotation. Therefore, there is a possibility of increasing methane emission and emission intensity in high grazing residual group during subsequent grazing rotation, because there's a possibility of increasing stem production and accumulation of dead material at the base of the pasture of high grazing residual group, and therefore there's a possibility of increasing fiber level in the pasture, and which will lower the passage rate of the intake inside the rumen, and it will increase the fermentation process, which will ultimately increase the methane emission. Additionally, these two graphs show the positive correlation between milk yield and the estimated enteric methane values in this study. According to the literature, I saw that methane emission increasing rate can be reduced by feeding better quality feed, which help to dilute the enteric methane emission per unit of fat and protein corrected milk. I hope to investigate further about this in future. At last, since there is no additional effect on enteric methane emission intensity reduction and additional milk production from concentrate supplementation compared to pure pasture feeding under well-managed grazing conditions in this study, I can conclude that there is a possibility to cut the supplementation of concentrate up to a certain level by feeding well-managed pasture without additional impact on enteric methane emission intensity. Which may help to reduce the production cost as well. Also, difference between post-grazing residual height of pasture does not influence on the changes of enteric methane emission or milk production at the beginning of the grazing rotation. However, more research required to look into impact of post-grazing residual height on these factors during subsequent grazing rotations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sineka, for that presentation. There was a question that came through. Oh, give me 1 second. What was the common type of forage in the pasture? Is there any difference due to the type of forage?
Yes, there can be a difference in terms of the forage types, because the nutrient composition of the forage can be different, and also the dry matter intake of the cows also can be different because of that, because of the difference of the forage type. So I didn't look into much into details because I'm doing my master research project. So, but there's a possibility of increasing that impact on enteric methane emission in terms of the different type of pasture.
Excellent. And the other question is, how high or how low do you think the concentrate levels can go? And what impact would that have?
Actually, in my research, I didn't look into that because this is a continuation of the PhD project. So, but it's like I hope to look into further using different like data from the different commercial level farming systems. Maybe in future, I will be able to answer those questions.
Excellent, Sineka. Thank you very much for your time and your presentation.
Thank you.
So our last speaker today is Laura Field from the University of Melbourne, talking about the Babysitters Club. Can calves benefit from spending time with older animals? Unfortunately, due to a last-minute change in schedule, Laura couldn't be with us here today, so we had to pre-record Laura's presentation, and I will share that presentation with you now.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Field and I'm doing a PhD with the Animal Welfare Science Centre at the University of Melbourne. After rearing calves in New South Wales and Scotland, I began my PhD exploring calf rearing practices which may improve individual development and welfare of dairy calves. So why study welfare and development? Aside from the ethical implications of safeguarding animal welfare, for an animal to reach its productive potential, it should have its needs met. Feed, water, shelter, healthcare, that's just common sense, right? But there's more to welfare than just survival. It's our responsibility to provide animals with their basic needs and to prevent poor welfare, but also to provide opportunities to experience positive emotions. This moves us from simply providing our animals with a life to a life worth living. Welfare isn't just for our animals' quality of life. Public perception of dairy cattle welfare strongly influences our social licence to farm, and our industry's continued success rides on our ability to look outwards and understand, examine, and incorporate the Australian community's animal welfare expectations into our production systems. My research explores some of the effects of early development and welfare of dairy heifers. All domesticated species, it's really rare for rodents and even humans, we know that the nature and quality of social contact experienced during early life plays a huge role in your long-term ability to cope with the world. A calf's lifelong social abilities, cognition, stress resilience, and behavioural adaptability are all shaped by its early life experiences. So does being deprived of socially derived developmental opportunities make it more difficult for heifers to integrate into the herd? Does it make it harder for them to learn and adapt to changing routines and social groupings across their productive lives? Previous research suggests that it does. My experiment explores some of the long-term developmental, production, and welfare effects of a more socially complex rearing environment. So in August of last year, we moved 40 two-week-old replacement heifers onto pasture in 4 groups of 10. All calves were reared identically. The only difference was that in the treatment calf paddocks, there were also 3 dry, empty cull cows acting as older social models. removing the element of maternal care while still providing the increased enrichment of adult interactions. After 10 weeks, the calves' responses to social isolation were tested in this enclosed arena. The calves explored the arena in groups of 5 before being individually reintroduced for testing, which involved being left alone in the closed arena for 4 minutes. As social animals, isolation is really stressful for cows. So by measuring a cow's behavioural response to this stress, we can see how she may deal with other stressful situations, as well as her level of social motivation. A less stressed animal is often safe to handle, more productive, and has higher reproductive success, among other benefits. So I recorded behaviours including vocalisations and locomotion, which were associated with attempts to return to the group, and vigilance, urination, and defecation, which are associated with stress. Today's results were taken from the behavioural tests of only 10 of our 40 calves, 5 treatment and 5 control, as we unfortunately lost the remaining video data. Despite the very small sample size, we did have some significant results, which is promising for our study moving forward. Compared to our treatment calves, the control calves walked and displayed vigilance behaviour much more frequently and for a longer duration. Vigilance behaviour suggests a higher reactivity to the relatively unfamiliar environment, while increased locomotion suggests a strong motivation to return to the social group. So my preliminary results suggest that the control calves were more stressed and worked harder to try to return to their social group than the treatment calves. In a 2012 study, individually reared calves showed similar responses to our control calves compared to pair-housed calves. The researchers suggested that socially deprived animals overreact to novel environments, perhaps due to higher fearfulness or emotionality. Rearing our treatment calves with older cows appears to have led to differences in the stress resilience and social development between our 2 experimental groups. What I'm particularly interested in looking into moving forward are the differences in behavioural development between groups throughout rearing. We need to bear in mind that these are only preliminary results. But luckily, this is a longitudinal study, and I'll follow the calves, investigating their reactions to restraint, milking, and the milking parlour, and their success at integrating into the herd. There are benefits to providing juvenile dairy heifers with more socially complex rearing environments, and this study will go some way into exploring exactly what these benefits may be, both immediately and for the entirety of the animal's lifespan. Got some acknowledgements, some references, and does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Laura, for the presentation. I think it was a really good insight into a good topic of interest that, as you mentioned, has a production and a welfare side, but also a social license aspect to it. 2 questions for you. Did you see any difference in either intake or growth of those animals over that period that you were monitoring, if you did monitor? And did you see any special behavior that got your attention in the dry cows?
So in terms of intake, I haven't analysed the data yet, but we were feeding starter to consumption. So I basically was checking it every day, emptying it out and putting new starter in. And the control calves did seem to eat more starter. So we're interested in looking at the videos to see if there was more grazing behaviour in the treatment calves, because grazing does seem to be a socially learnt behaviour. So we're wondering if that difference in grain intake might have been met instead through grazing and grass consumption. And what was your second question? Sorry, behaviour in the cows.
Yes.
They put on a lot of weight. So I think one of them put on like 80 kilos in 10 weeks or something. Like, they were really healthy. Behaviour-wise, they were just pretty happy out in the paddock. There wasn't anything special going on, except one cow became very attached to one calf, spent a lot of time grooming her, trying to get her to suckle even though she wasn't producing milk. So that was interesting. But nothing out of the ordinary apart from that, really.
Excellent, Laura. Thank you very much for your presentation.
It's okay, thanks.
Well, so thank you very much, Laura, virtually now. While I call all the emerging scientists to turn on the camera again for a final picture of all of us together, I want to thank all of them once again for the quality and the diversity in the research they're doing. It's been really great part of the symposium again to hear from all of them. All the abstracts will be available at the Dairy Research Foundation website in due course, and so will the video and the recording of the presentation. So I want to thank also the people that are judging their presentations, and we'll announce the results towards the end. And once again, thank Local Land Services Hunter for sponsoring this session here today. So once again, thanks all of you. And Sarah and Pat, maybe you can turn on your screen for a final picture of all of us now. Once again, a big round of applause to you for your time and your contribution here today. So with that, we are standing for a picture on an online event, but we'll break now for a short break, and we'll start again 10:30 with our last session for the symposium, session 2 of day 2, innovation. See you at all 10:30. Thank you very much.